It was the summer of 2019, and my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip to the remote woods of Maine. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon and quickly set up our tents. The woods were dense, with gnarled trees, thick undergrowth that blocked out the sun. As night fell, we started a campfire and sat around it, telling stories and enjoying the peacefulness of the woods. However, things started to get strange when we heard strange noises coming from the woods. At first we thought it was just animals moving around, but the noises grew louder and more frequent, and it sounded like something was moving closer to our campsite. The rustling of leaves, footsteps, and even whispers echoed through the forest. We tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere was so thick with tension we could hardly concentrate on anything else. The woods seemed alive with sinister energy, as if something was watching us from the woods. Suddenly, one of my friends pointed to the woods and screamed, "What the hell is that?" We all turned and looked, and what we saw made our blood run cold. Emerging from the darkness was a figure dressed in tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadows, but we could see that it was carrying a large rusted knife. The figure started to approach us slowly, and we all stood frozen in terror. But it was as if the figure was drawing us closer. The air was thick with a putrid smell, and the woods around us seemed to come alive with whispers and groans. As the figure got closer, we could see its clothes were torn and dirty, as if it had been living in the woods for years. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, animalistic hunger, and we knew that we were in grave danger. We scrambled to pack up what we had, and ran away as fast as we could, our hearts pounding with fear. The figure followed us, its laughter echoing through the woods. We could hear the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling as it drew closer, following us. We finally made it to our car and drove away as fast as possible, our eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. We could see the figure standing in the darkness, watching us with hungry eyes. After we left the woods, we couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching us. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows. When we finally arrived back at our homes, we were all shaken and traumatized by the experience. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, we tried to rationalize what we had seen. Maybe it was just a prankster, or a crazy person living in the woods, we thought. But the memory of that putrid smell and twisted laughter still haunts us to this day. It was a warm summer evening when two best friends, John and Matt, set up their tent in the woods for a weekend camping trip. They had always enjoyed the outdoors, and they were excited to spend some time away from the city, surrounded by nature. After they finished setting up their tent, they spent the rest of the day hiking and exploring the woods. They saw some beautiful sights and even stumbled upon a hidden waterfall. As the sun began to set, they returned to their tent and started a small fire to cook their dinner. As they sat around the fire, they talked and laughed, reminiscing about old times. The night sky was clear, and the stars were shining brightly. It was a peaceful and relaxing night, and they were both looking forward to getting some sleep. Eventually, they climbed into their tent and settled for the night. They both fell asleep quickly, exhausted from their day of exploring. But sometime in the middle of the night, John was awakened by a strange noise. It was a rustling sound, like something was moving outside the tent. He lay there for a moment, listening intently. But the noise stopped. Thinking it was just an animal, he tried to go back to sleep. But then he heard it again, only this time it was closer. He sat up and listened, but everything was quiet. He nudged Matt awake, telling him he heard something outside the tent. Matt sat up, straining to hear any noise. Everything was silent. They both sat there for a few minutes, listening, but nothing happened. Eventually, they lay back down and tried to go back to sleep. But then, John heard the noise again. This time it was right outside the tent. He sat up and his heart was racing with fear. He whispered to Matt that something was outside. They sat there, frozen in terror, as they heard the sound of someone, or something, walking around their tent. They could hear heavy breathing and the rustling of leaves as things moved around them. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds grew louder and more frantic. John and Matt were too scared to move, too afraid of what they might see if they opened the tent. Eventually, the sound stopped, and they lay there in silence, listening to the quiet of the woods. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid of what might happen if they closed their eyes. The next morning, they packed up their tent and left the woods like normal. As they drove away from the woods, though, John and Matt couldn't help but feel relieved they had survived the night. But as they were leaving, they noticed something strange in their rearview mirror. There was a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching them leave. It was too far away to see any detail, but they could tell it was humanoid in shape. John and Matt exchanged a glance, both feeling a chill run down their spines. They knew that they had been hunted by something in the woods, and that whatever it was still out there watching them. As they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something truly sinister. They never spoke of the experience again, but it stays with them, haunting them in their dreams, reminding them of the terrifying night they spent in the woods. It was a beautiful summer day when 3 friends, Sarah, Mike, and David, decided to go on a camping trip deep in the woods. They were all excited to spend some time away from the city and explore the natural beauty that surrounded them. As they hiked deeper into the woods, they marveled at the stunning views and the quiet serenity of the forest. They walked for hours, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. But as the day wore on, they realized they had lost track of time. Then, while hiking down a narrow ravine, they realized their friend Sarah was missing. They called out her name, but there was no answer. After searching for what felt like hours, they decided to head back to camp to see if she'd returned on her own. But when they arrived, Sarah was nowhere to be found. Panicking, they decided to head back out and look for her again. As they searched, they found a small, dilapidated cabin that looked abandoned. They decided to investigate, hoping that Sarah might have taken refuge there. But as they entered the cabin, they realized it was far from abandoned. There were strange symbols and drawings scrawled on the walls, and the air was thick with an unidentifiable scent. Suddenly, they heard a noise outside. As they rushed to investigate, to their relief, they found Sarah stumbling towards them, dazed and confused. As they tried to question her about what happened, they realized that something was off. Sarah had lost her memory and couldn't remember anything that had happened to her since she'd gone missing. They took her back to camp and tried to make her comfortable, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. They couldn't explain how Sarah had ended up wandering in the woods with no memory of what had happened to her. As night drew on, they heard strange noises coming from the woods around them. They heard what sounded like whispers and footsteps, but when they investigated, there was no one there. The next morning, they decided to leave the woods and head back home. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, though. And as they were packing up, they noticed something strange. Marks on Sarah's arm. They felt like they had seen them before, but they couldn't be certain. Finally, Mike realized they were the same symbols they had seen, scrawled on the inside of that strange cabin in the woods. To this day, they still don't know what happened to Sarah in the woods, but they all remember the eerie feeling that settled over them. The feeling of being watched and hunted by something dark and sinister. They'll never forget the fear, and they'll always wonder what secrets the forest held that they may never fully understand.